sector in the US last month. It was what you might call pent-up demand, immediate demand, which could not be fulfilled in the crux of a pandemic and which is now being acted. But I think we will see a slowing down of this retail sector in the period ahead. And second point, which is very important, we see very much that unemployment, the surge of unemployment, is here to stay for the coming years. And this uncertainty and this insecurity about economic future for household will, in a way, refrain demand. And if you take the US, the largest single consumer in the world, in 2019, the level of saving, household saving, was the lowest in recorded economic history of the US. It was at 1.4% of GDP before the pandemic, before the surge of unemployment. And so this is why you will have the problem of making sure that we don't have deflation instead of having to fight inflation. And we have seen that systematically, every single think tank, every single central bank has been downgrading their forecast, adjusting downward their forecast about inflation. And the last point is the fact that despite the fact that we have zero interest rates, that this will last at least until 2023. At least if you listen to Mr. Powell as an example, or even if you listen to the Director General of the ECB, you have companies which for the moment think that it is very crucial to save their cash, to be very prudent about investment, to make sure that their first priority is to restore business on the basis of additional cost reductions. And so you have this environment where you will have huge supply of money, no inflations, interest rates at zero for the next 2, 3, 4 years. And of course, this is going to create additional imbalances in the economies, because what you will see is a growing discrepancy, for instance, in the US between, for instance, saving rates, which are near to zero, and accumulated current account deficit. Or you will have in Germany the reverse situation, where you will have, on the one hand, declining saving rates because Germans now are ready to spend more to try to accelerate the recovery, but you will have a current account balance which will remain very largely on positive territory. And so these are the sources for further tensions in the global economy, even as we get into some kind of recovery in the next 3 years. Now, let's see what are the trends that the crisis, the pandemic crisis generating an economic recession or even depression, what are the trends that this is either accelerating and amplifying or even creating? Number one, let me make an assumption. Chinese economy will emerge from the crisis stronger, and the American economy will emerge from the crisis in a weaker position. And this will have a very important consequence with respect to the positioning, influence, interdependence in terms of economy and business between China and ASEAN countries, which will regain their position as the fastest growing region in the world. Second very important implication, we are seeing the differential. We are seeing a widening of a differential between I don't know what is.
Can I request everybody to please mute themselves?
Sorry. We are seeing a growing differential in economic might between Germany and France. Already the gap was quite wide already in 2019, and it will expand after the crisis, during the crisis and after the crisis. We see also that the discussion about the 750 billion euros that the European Commission want to use to spur the recovery through loans, grants, and guarantees is triggering a major debate about the philosophy, about the raison d'être, if you want, of the European Union. And at the moment, this very ambitious plan of 750 billion euros to be launched to help countries like Spain, Italy, France to recover from the crisis. For this moment, this plan is at a deadlock because it requires unanimity, and 5 countries are saying, not even over my dead body. And so you have this situation where the crisis is illustrating the extent to which the European Union and the European economies are in this kind of safe, half-baked mode, which in a way prevent the European Union, the Eurozone, to act as a much more active player in a way regenerating economic growth, not only in the region, but at the global level. The point number 3 that we see, and which is very worrisome, and Sanjay has mentioned that in his introduction, is that the crisis has accelerated and amplified the pressures and the deterioration of the global trading system. Look at what we are today. Even today, or yesterday, the US government has said that if Europe wants to install a digital tax, which is the official plan of the EU, to some extent, hell will break loose if we listen to Mr. Lighthizer. And it goes without saying that at this moment, any hope of having an EU-US trade agreement is dead. Look at what is happening between Europe and China, Australia and China, Japan and Australia and China, not speaking even of US and China. Everywhere you have this trend toward taking a tougher line against Chinese investment and Chinese acquisitions in sectors deemed to be of strategic importance for the countries concerned. And you can expect and even make sure that Beijing will not be sitting on their hands while this happens. There will be an escalation of tit for tat, and this will contribute even more to deteriorate the global investment and trade climate. Look then at what we see about the trend in Europe, in the US, to buy local. And this trend, for economic reason, because people want to protect jobs in their vicinity, because of environment reasons, because of concern about safety, for instance, of food, this trend will remain even after the pandemic has been tamed. So you have all these elements which are today creating a situation which doesn't bode well for what will happen with international trade in the coming years. And even more worrisome is the fact that to have a stabilization of a situation, you need a reform of WTO so that WTO can play again a role of referees between parties, the role of the institution setting global rules for trade. But the Americans are definitely dead on making sure that the reform of WTO will be targeted toward forcing China, if it wants to remain inside the WTO, to get closer to the free market systems that we have in the EU and in the US. And of course, China has no intention of doing that. And nobody can see how a World Trade Organization could function if China remain outside of this framework. And it is, as we know, the second largest economy in the world and on its way to becoming the #1 economy in the world, and with interdependence between China and a number of countries growing and not diminishing if you take out what is happening in terms of a decoupling between the US and China. And so we see a situation where in the coming years, the whole challenge of at least stabilizing the global system, the global architecture in itself, I'm not even talking about improving it, but stabilizing it, stopping the deterioration, will be a huge uphill task. Now, let me, in a way, end by mentioning 3 key points that will have a long impact for the future. Number 1, we have been speaking about the deterioration between the US and China, between the decoupling between the US and China. And we have been talking about how today people want to redraw global supply chains. They want to delocalize activities from China, broaden sourcing bases, and get from right on time, and rather than right on time, being sure that they have a safety margin. But in a way, this is easier said than done. We see that a number of American companies, despite all the prodding of the Trump administration, have very significant difficulties delocalizing from China, from their activities in China, and they will have even more difficulties renouncing to the Chinese of the Chinese market as a sourcing base as well as a market. But if there is a broadening of sourcing base, it will go toward regionalization of supply chains. We see that happening in Asia, and in fact, interestingly enough, China is part of this trend. This is, for instance, a trend where recipient countries like Thailand and Vietnam are today emerging as big beneficiaries. We see that trend despite the catastrophic policy of the Mexican president, López Obrador. We see the same situation with respect to the US, Canada, and Mexico. But in that respect, it raised a very interesting question for India. Where is India in all this? In what way can India benefit from this regionalization of supply chain? How to become a place where when people say, okay, let us not think about right in time, but right on time, but rather right to have when we need it, where does India position itself? And I am sorry to say that at this moment, India is not doing a good job at that. And letting, as I said, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, getting the maximum benefit of this situation. The second issue or trend which has been really exacerbated and which will have long-term implication is how the confrontation between the US and China has been escalating and moving from one domain to the other. First, it was trade. Then it was geopolitics. Then it was technology and technology innovation. Then it has become ideologic. And we don't see any backpedaling on this escalation of confrontation. And even if Mr. Trump is replaced by Mr. Biden next November at the White House, we don't see Mr. Biden reversing that trend. We might see more of a calibrated decoupling, because there could not be a kind of black and white decoupling, but we would not see a reverse and return to business as usual. And so this creates a number of challenges for countries which will be caught in between. Of course, these kind of countries, you can mention Korea, you can mention Israel. And looking at the present situation at the border between China and India, I think one danger for India is to be caught in between. Because in a way, I think one danger is for India to be seen as a hedge against China. And I think it creates ground for very serious strategic thinking in Delhi. And I will finish by the last issue or the last trend. We have in developed economies very strong forces among the ecologist movements wanting to use the crisis to accelerate the drive toward the low carbon economy because of the climate change challenge. At the same time, you have a tremendous pressure to do whatever it takes to accelerate the recovery. Of course, in the long term, these two goals are not necessarily antinomic, but in the short term, they are, whether we like it or not. When you look at the situation of crucial sectors in developed economies and even in India, like automotive industry, like aerospace industry, air transport industry, at the moment, the priority is to restore activity because these are huge multiplier sectors in economic activity. And so, given what we see, especially in countries in Europe, in some sectors or some states in America, This kind of contradictory pressure between the urgency of the recovery and the wish of this group to use the crisis to accelerate the drive toward the decarbonization of the economy. This will make economic decision-making and corporate decision-making more difficult. I would like to stop here, and I know that you want to have time for question, as you mentioned to me, Rekha, and so we might use the time, that whatever is left of the time, to go into question and answers. Just one last point, so that people who have been joining the call are not despairing because I mentioned quite a number of figures. I mentioned to Rekha that I will send the outline or synopsis of my remarks for whoever wants to have them.
Thank you, Claude. I'm sorry, I'll take over from Rekha. Well, that was a great presentation. I mean, not only did you give us how we got into this mess, if I can call it that, the situation that was going on before the pandemic, and how this pandemic has probably made it worse. And you also spoke about, what you see going ahead, as in what's going to happen with the US and China. This decoupling, is it going to take place? And you were very clear that regardless of whether Mr. Trump won or not, they were on two different paths, and that the US and possibly Western Europe would want a China in WTO only if it plays by the rules of the WTO. And recently I read an article about how actually China is investing more and more into global institutions, trying to get a bigger and bigger share of them, and using the existing global institutions and trying to get them across to its point of view. You also spoke about India and how we could be caught in between, and we need to think very strategically. And unfortunately, I am one who believes that throughout history, Indians have not thought very strategically. We are there more for the moment, and we don't have that long-term view. But these are my personal views, including the last point that you made about the carbon economy and how we really need, if we want to come back, there is a great dependence on the old carbon economy, and maybe we need to go out further, put that low carbon economy goal a little further down the road, while working to ensure that we do go down towards that road. So let me start with the questions, and I would add to the first question that I have seen over here. It's from Mr. Mohammed Ansari. He said that COVID should persuade the world to cooperate more than earlier, but one notices a contrary view, a wave of narrowly defined nationalism. And what is your take on it? And I would add to that by asking you, do you think it would have been different if Hillary Clinton would have won instead of Donald Trump? Because quite a lot of things that have happened in the last few years, maybe Donald Trump represents obviously he represents what America wants, but that's a personal point of view. So that was the first question.
Okay. First of all, I mean, let me take the second point first. Definitely, and God knows I am not an advocate of Hillary Clinton, but definitely things would have been better if there had been somebody else than Mr. Trump at the White House. Why? Because in a way, Trump has been bringing back this notion of the US taking revenge on a world which has been cheating on the US until Mr. Trump came to the White House, which is, of course, a completely false, wrong perception of reality and description of reality. And so there are structural problems. There were such structural problems. The issues with China were existing already at the time of the Obama presidency. But Mr. Trump, with his way of thinking that negotiating just means twisting the arm of your interlocutor, has aggravated the situation. He has antagonized Europe and Japan, despite all the effort of Mr. Abe to paint himself as the good friend of Mr. Trump. And he has created a mood in China where people see the efforts of the US again as the effort of a white man to contain and block the rightful, legitimate return of China to the center of a global stage. When Mr. Trump came to power, some assumptions were already, in a way, becoming obsolete. On the US side, the assumption that, in a way, as China developed its economy, it will evolve closer to the US and European model. And in fact, this was pure wishful thinking because, to be honest and fair, at the very moment when China became a member of WTO, the official pronouncements of the Chinese leadership, clear and simple, were our goal is to build a socialist economy with Chinese characteristics. They never said our goal is to join the Western model. But on the other side, the assumption on the Chinese side were becoming obsolete. The assumption that China could continue to benefit from the opportunities that the systems in the US and Europe were offering in terms of catching up with technology, in terms of benefiting from investment, without at some stage, in a way, triggering a reassessment, triggering a reevaluation of the very nature of a relationship between China and the Western world. And so anyway, a period was coming to an end. And this meant really a strategic reassessment. This meant a dialogue and negotiation between the US and China. And in fact, this is what Mr. Xi Jinping offered to Mr. Obama in 2013 when they had their summit in California. When Xi Jinping arrived at the summit with Obama in California in May, if I'm not mistaken, 2013, he said, I want to create a new model of relationship between great nations. This was his official words. It meant, I want to create a pattern, a framework where China and the US deal on an equal footing basis. The Obama administration, because they didn't have good experts on China, in a way swept that as a kind, oh, this is again one of these kind of rhetoric that the Chinese use, you know, and these are just, let us talk about trade and let us talk about that. And so a window of opportunity in 2013 was lost. And so the situation that we are facing today will have arrived but it would have been much more manageable, much less dangerous for the world economy, when much less costly for countries in between, if we have had another president at the White House with some kind of strategic perspective. Now, going back to the first point of your question, I think in the present context, the best way of recreating the seeds of international cooperation is using the pandemic, of creating the demonstration that issues such as this, or climate change, or cybersecurity, just to take a few examples, can be dealt with only through international cooperation. And in that respect, I am really sorry to say that the stupidity of the Trump administration has offered the golden opportunity to China for propaganda success. Mr. Xi Jinping saying, if we find the vaccine, we will make it available to the whole world. And China being ready to be part of a consortium of companies to accelerate efforts and coordination to find the vaccine, and the US refusing to be part of this consortium, and Mr. Trump saying, if we find the vaccine in the US will be served first before we think of other countries. And so I think it is very important at this stage to use the very pressing, emotional, life or death issue of the pandemic to demonstrate that cooperation might create the best hope to tackle this kind of problem. And I think it is very good that countries like India, Europe, Japan, China are saying, we want to cooperate. We want to continue to work with WHO. We want to see how we are going to share the results and share any benefit we can discover with effective medicine, or even better, with a vaccine.
Thank you. Our past president, Mr. Sudhir Jalan, is also on this call. Possibly, I'm sure you have met him earlier. He will ask you the next question.
Sure.
Jalan?
Hello, Claude. First of all, First of all, congratulations on a masterful presentation of the international scenario. I'm bringing you straight to the Indian point of view. Besides the pandemic problem, we have a major problem with China, which of course has been escalated in the last few days, because both of us are looking at leadership of Asia. And secondly, we have a problem that we cannot stimulate the economy as much as we would have wanted, because the fear of sovereign rating going junk. So that has kept us negative. And today, Fitch, for example, has brought our rating down to negative. Now, in view of this, what should be done by the government of India? And how do you look at India 1 year down the line, particularly in regard to the GDP growth rate and exchange rate?
Okay, let me, as a friend of India, as somebody who have come to India, who has traveled regularly to India now for 49 years, as somebody who knows who has so many good Indian friends, I think India should find a way should try to find ways for long-term accommodation and modus vivendi with China. Of course, it takes two to tango. And if there is to be long-term accommodation, it means that the two players have the same interest, are ready to make the same kind of compromise to achieve that. As I mentioned, I think the danger at the present moment with the Trump policy is that India be seen as a hedge against China. I truly believe that this is really, really, really against the midterm and long-term interest of India as a great nation, as a nation with great potential. Now, the issues that I see, because I speak about that a lot also with my Chinese friend, is that there is an incredible deficit of trust between the two countries. And there are incredible misperceptions. There are incredible misperceptions between the two countries. When I speak, for instance, with young entrepreneurs in Bangalore, and when I speak with young Chinese entrepreneurs in Beijing or in Shanghai, both of these groups, they would love to have more interaction. They would love to have more, in a way, cooperation in some projects. But again, you have these misperceptions. And I think a program on the two countries, by the two countries, to create more exchanges of people, more communication of people, would be the first order of the day. China is convinced that India is becoming a tool in the US effort to contain China. India is convinced that China has aggressive intention against it. And so this is the kind of, in a way, vicious circle that needs to be broken. What has happened at the border is truly unfortunate. And I think at the moment, despite the pressure of public opinions, it is important to restore some calm, to try to get into a more level-headed discussion. There is nothing to be gained, neither in China nor in India, in the rise of tensions. And let us not forget that from a pure economic standpoint, at this stage in the Chinese economy, India could be a very good partner. And when you look at India's ambitions in terms of infrastructure, for instance, China could bring a lot. And so it is really a pity that we have this kind of long-lasting antagonism. I really don't think that India and China are in competition for the leadership in Asia. Geography says otherwise. Whether we like it or not, the primary player more and more for the ASEAN countries will be China. I think it should be the strategy of India to latch on into the dynamism, even though now there is this crisis, this slowdown of the economies, to latch on the dynamism in the ASEAN countries. And I don't think, although there would be competition between some services and products that Chinese firms can offer and what Indian companies can offer, there could be competition. But I don't think that one is exclusive from the other. I think to see that as one being exclusive from the other is really not a full view of a picture. And this is not what Asian countries would like to see. Singapore wants to have as good relations and productive relations with China as with India. Uh, this is the same when you look also at the Gulf countries, for instance, where India has a strong position, has a strong community there, and China has been very active, and so on and so forth. I don't know if I answer fully this question, but this is really how I look at things, going into and having a discussion in these two big countries.
Thank you, Claude. We also have Rajiv Kaul, past president of the call.
Yes, I was seeing Rajiv on the screen. Hi, Rajiv. How are you?
I'm very well, Claude. So nice hearing your outstanding analysis, as always. I've been hearing you, I think, now for maybe 31 or 32 years.
Oh my God.
And you're getting better and better year by year. And for all those in AIMA, let me tell you that Claude's daughter, Yael, addressed AIMA National, the NMC, I think also about 24 years ago. So Claude, she addressed us before you did, because I think you began addressing, you were busy addressing CII that time, and not AIMA, where the thinking power is. So I'm glad you're here with us.
I am delighted to be here.
Anyway, you know, let me be candid, like you're candid, but you're so suave and much more polished than I am. But I think Sudhir Jalan's question that you just have been answering, I don't think would have satisfied many of us. And let me explain to you why, and then seek your, in a way, final words of guidance on the same issue or very similar issue. Going back to 64, you know, when we had our major war with China, India was very badly defeated, very, very badly. We were humiliated, and we lost, if I remember correctly, 40,000 square kilometers of our territory to them. Very recently, I mean, in the last couple of weeks, we've lost, I think, another couple of 100 kilometers of their territory. And, you know, that is something which is not palatable, or, you know, one cannot accept that we'll be friendly and losing our territory. So that is a major concern. And whilst what you may be saying makes economic sense, but China has been kind of surrounding India as well. They've been investing very heavily in Pakistan, I think around $50 billion US, building the road and other infrastructure along with the road. They've been building and wooing Sri Lanka for the last 10 years quite successfully. And of late, they've been wooing China. It began 5 years ago on account of some trade and blockade disputes on the roads. But thereafter, you know, China has exploited that to their advantage. So when one takes a balance between economic benefits and the national mood and national sentiment, I think the sentiment kind of, certainly in the shorter term, going few years, gets priority over the economic interest. So, and there is, I mean, it is an undisputed fact that COVID sort of came from China. It may not have been deliberate, or it may have been deliberate. One doesn't know. President Trump is the one who started saying and championing the theory that may have come from the lab. One doesn't know, but it certainly created economic turmoil in the world, much less so for China than the others in the world. You yourself said that economic growth rates in France and Italy, etc., will be around 10%, and China will be the first to come out of it also. That's also what you said. So keeping all this in mind and knowing that you're an India lover, it'll be great to have your thinking and comments, Claude.
Yes, thank you, Rajiv. Let me first deal with the issue of COVID. Mr. Trump has been saying that it was originated in a laboratory near the market, patati patata. Let us just repeat that his own intelligence services and the intelligence services of the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand have been definitive that this is not true. They have been definitive. The US intelligence agencies have officially contradicted the President of the United States. So this is really a canard which was launched, which is not true. This is point number one. Number two, it is true that the COVID originated in China, but let us face it, it could have originated, this kind of pandemic or another kind of pandemic could tomorrow originate in India, originate in Indonesia, we don't know. And why did China limit the numbers? Because, and sorry to say that, I mean, we don't like to admit it, because of the nature of the Chinese regime, because they were able to quarantine hermetically 60 million people. They were able to tell 3,000 or 5,000 doctors living 3,000 kilometers away, now you pack your things and tomorrow night you are in Wuhan to treat COVID people. And look at the mess in the US. Just think about one element. The official number of deaths in China is 4,800 something. Let us assume that this figure is wrong, that in fact the real figure is 20 times more, which is quite wide. It means 96 or 97,000 dead. At the present day, as we speak, the US has 120,000 dead, which is with a population which is less than a quarter the population of China. And it shows the mess that the Trump administration has created with its incompetence and inefficiency. And the problems that we have today because of this incompetence and inefficiency is that instead of having a unified policy as China or France or Germany or Switzerland had, where you establish a policy for the whole population, the Trump administration, because he's thinking of his re-election, is saying, I don't want to deal with that. This is the States. So what you have are rolling peaks of a pandemic. New York was the #1 casualty. Now New York is okay, but what is happening? California, Florida, Texas, Arizona, which were very low and people were saying, okay, they are out of the woods. Now they are going back and they have to reinstate confinement. This is why the US will be coming out of a recession later than China. And so it has nothing to do with a conspiracy or something like that. Now, let me go back to a crucial point that you are making. And I know, and we even discussed that together, how emotional the issue of China is being in India. And I can understand why. I can really understand why. But the question is, what is India going to do? Are you going to declare war to China? Of course not. Of course not. Are you going to say, okay, we want to ignore that we have a giant with whom we share 3,500 kilometers of border, and we are going to do as they don't exist, and when we have tensions or skirmishes at the border, we will react? No. At some stage, for India's sake, you need to find accommodation. At some stage, and I know the trauma of the 64 war, I know I have spoken so many times with friends in Delhi, but at some stage, you have to say, okay, now we are in the 21st century, let us find ways. Germany in Europe, they found ways to do that. They found ways to do that. India is today struggling to get to the $5 trillion GDP. You were hoping to get to that by 2025. Unfortunately, this hope for 2025, this goal is evaporating. The national sentiment, the emotions are very important. But, my God, there is a whole generation in India. I mean, there are people of quality who want a better life, who want to have access to progress, who want to do things because they have the capabilities. And so today, it is in a way, for at least as I see it, the number one priority. And it is a completely different situation, completely different. I was born in Tunisia. My family was an okay family, etc., etc. When we came to Switzerland, we could not take anything because of the socialist government, because we were Jews, etc., etc. And literally speaking, we came in Switzerland with our luggage, period. And for some time, really, you were thinking, why did we lose all of that? We didn't do anything wrong. We were good citizens, etc., etc. But at some stage you say, okay, that was history, that was life. I was invited by the Tunisian government before to go to Tunisia to make speeches, to meet the prime minister. I made a point to host the prime minister in Davos on 3 occasions. At some stage, I know it looks harsh, but you need to turn the page. And sometimes it is difficult. I mean, you have still French people harboring grudges against Germany. Italians are harboring grudges against Germany. Not speaking even about the Jews and what happened with the Holocaust. But today, for instance, Israel and Germany have Germany has, from all the European countries, Germany is the country which has the best relations with Israel. So that is my point. And I know it is easier said than done, especially I am not an Indian, I am speaking but I think there should be forces. I think, for instance, AIMA and other organizations should say, okay, let us every year take 50 young leaders, business leaders from China and from India, put them together, and you will see what happens. You will have 25 new projects. I bet on that, you know? And it starts like that. It starts like that. But if we don't start like that, where does it lead? Sorry, I mean, I cannot.
Thank you, Claude. You really spoke from the heart, and your emotions came through. Now, we had booked you from 6 to 7 Indian Standard Time. I realize we've gone past, and the Swiss make the best watches in the world. But can I extend it to for another question or two?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I am afraid I'm speaking too much. I am afraid. This is what my wife and my daughter say all the time. My doctor objective is to cut one word out of two or one of what I write or what I say.
Okay.
You know?
But it was very enjoyable listening to you, Claude. So I'm glad you spoke from your heart. And let me endorse entirely what our president, Sanjay, has just said, that it was wonderful hearing you. And perhaps not today, but in the days ahead, I made that good idea, getting 50 bright minds from both countries sitting together.
Yes.
Yeah. So the last question, which I've been just sent by Rekha, is from Ramashekar Pandey. Will COVID be known as the final blow to the democratic rule-based world order and a win for the Chinese dictatorship system?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Let me put it, and again, I was not born a diplomat. Let me put it that way. COVID might be the last nail in the coffin of the prominence of the Western world. This started already some time ago with globalization. In this phase of globalization, when people realized that you could have good technology, good management, good products, and low cost. And this, in a way, was really a very bad blow to the mentality of acquired advantages in the Western world. And this is why the middle class in the Western world was the traditional middle class of the Western world was the big loser of globalization. These are the people who voted for Trump or who are voting for the far right in France or Italy. Then you had the 2008-2009 crisis. And in Asia and in China especially, people realized that the Western world didn't have the answer to all the problems, that when it was faced with the same problems, Western countries were doing exactly the opposite of what they were telling Asian countries to do. When you remember the Asian crisis and how the IMF pushed down the throat of ASEAN countries the so-called Washington Consensus. And in fact, it is from the 2000-2009 crisis that in fact somebody like Xi Jinping, when you look at his thinking, realized that China could aspire to become the equal of Western power. Now with the COVID crisis, we have gone to another step, which is that the US has been among the most inefficient countries in dealing with the pandemic. Yes, The pandemic originated in China, but China has been very efficient. Look at what they are doing today. Today, people were saying, oh my God, the second wave or something like that. Altogether, since last week, there have been about 148 cases, new cases. 148 cases on a population of 1.4 billion people. And again, the whole machine is in full-fledged war footing. Lockdown, stop domestic flight, it will work, and they will contain that. And so this crisis, and in fact, what Singapore did, or what Japan did, but with the twist of a Japan mentality where you don't need to order people to do something. You just tell them that if they do that, it will be good for the community, and they will do it. And you see, and through that, people are saying, oh, after all, there are other recipes. The Western world is not as efficient as we thought it was. Technology, innovation, we can also master. And so, in a way, what we see today is more, and this is why people speak about the end of globalization. I think it is the end of globalization being equalized or being seen as synonymous of Americanization. This is the end of it. But this is the multifaceted globalization with strong regional dimension. This is a new form, a new avatar, if you want, or a new step in this globalization process. But people are too much, in a way, influenced by this model that if it is not globalization led by Citibank and Morgan Stanley and so on and so forth, and the IMF, then globalization is dead. No, it is not dead, but it is a multifaceted, a new phase in this process, which really started at the end of the 80s. So it is more that, but it is true also that we will continue to have democratic countries, India, Europe, the US, and we will have countries like China saying, we have another model, and we want to be able to continue with this other model. We are not asking anybody to change their model. Don't ask us to change our model. And this is, in fact, the problem. How do you get these two models, which today have equal critical economic mass, to collaborate, despite their differences?
Yeah, thank you, Claude. You know, I had read somewhere that either it was Lenin or Marx, maybe Marx, who said that capitalists will sell you the rope to hang them with. And, you know, if I remember, it was the Western world that was forcing the developing world into globalization. And at the end of the day, it was the companies and their leaders who made millions of dollars who actually benefited, and the workers lost out in the Western world. So the message that I get from what you have said is that it is going to be a multipolar globalization, so to speak. And in addition, India should strive, India should work hard to get its rightful place in this multipolar globalized world.
And India has a lot to bring, because you have a culture, you have a number of values which are very important in the context of globalization. And I think it is a pity that India is not using that more in terms, people speak so much about soft power. How does India leverage its soft power? It has, you know?
Yeah, thank you. I think with that we shall end. But you know, like my past presidents have told me, it's Rekha who always has the last word. So I will let her end this session. But from my side, thank you so much. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. It has been really a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claude. It's been a absolutely fascinating session. And if you see the comments in the chat, I think most of the delegates agree with me. We had over 200 people on Zoom, but we had over 1,200 people on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So I think everybody had a very good session with you today. Fascinating insights on China, especially. So thank you, Claude. And I guess I'm going to twist your arm to come back to us very soon once again.
Would love that. Thank you so much. And
Thanks, Claude.
keep safe, all of you.
Yes,
And I
you
look
too.
forward to be back to India as soon as possible.
Look
Thank
forward to that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Special invitation to you, Claude. Special invitation. Please
Thank
come.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.